If you're listening to this and you haven't gone to confession in a long time, take this as your sign, right? Go to confession. Just know that the Lord's love is going to come to you in that sacrament, and his spirit is one of peace, not anxiety.
This is the best of the week on Relevant Radio.
Saying I'm sorry and meaning it is just one of a number of elements that go into making a good confession. We're going to look at those elements today on the show with our spiritual director, Father John LoCoco. Father LoCoco is the parochial administrator at St. John Vianney Parish in Brookfield, Wisconsin, and he also serves as the judicial vicar for the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. Welcome back to the show, Father.
It's great to be with you.
Yeah, good to be with you, too. Has this been your experience, Father? I mean, that particularly perhaps guys have sometimes struggled with saying I'm sorry?
Oh, yeah. I think my involvement in a ministry that we have here locally is Men of Christ. And so working with a lot of those men, and then also my time as vocation director, that's such an integral step in our spiritual life to be able to, it requires a certain level of like emotional sort of maturity. And if we want to grow in the spiritual life, really mastering this capacity to have contriteness of heart and to be able to voice it is so integral.
Yeah, exactly. You know, when I first teased this show, Father, I was putting together the promo for the show, and, I asked the question of, what do you think makes a good confession? And I think if I were asked that question, if I was just coming out of the confessional and somebody said to me, so did you have a good confession? I think my thoughts immediately would go to, well, how did I feel coming out of it? Of course, that's not really it. That's not what goes into making a good confession, because the feelings sometimes they're there, sometimes they're not. And I'm grateful then that we're exploring this. But let's start with all confessions aren't necessarily created equal, right? There are better confessions and worse confessions.
Absolutely. And as a confessor, and I would also share as a penitent too, wanting to be able to make a good confession is important. And when we say good, there is an emotional element of it. We don't always feel good admitting to our faults, but ultimately, if our sins are absolved, that's a good confession. But we want it to be whole, integral, and our contrition to be something that we call perfect. And that we're doing it not because we feel bad or squeamish or guilty, but precisely because we love God and we want to return to communion with him. I think one of the best scriptural examples of how we shouldn't sort of be fearful of our sorrow for our sin is Peter's first experience of the Lord teaching from the boat, seeing the Lord's sort of authority with which he taught. What does Peter do? He prostrates himself and he says, "Depart from me, Lord, for I'm a sinful man." That's a good place to begin in the spiritual life. And so to be able to make a good confession and to do so, of course, with a certain frequency that's contingent to our sinfulness, right, is a really important place to be. I remember reading from St. John Paul II that he talked about his desire for confession being like his desire for the Lord in the Eucharist. And I was like, I do not desire communion like the way I desire confession. But I think to his point, it's like the Lord is integrally and wholly there, and it's a place of love, and just like the Eucharist is. And so I always use that as an image to begin with.
I love that because it really sets up what is going on inside. Well, at one point, a good friend of mine was joking around with our parish priest one time, and he glanced over at the confessional and he said, "Well, Father, we'll see you in the penalty box." And I said, no, that's not the penalty box. That's the grace box. I mean, the confessional, right? It's a place of that intimate encounter, much like when we receive Holy Communion.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a spiritual formation director in college seminary, who's from Poland. And he was so joyful. And he had this image that he would share about going to confession. I'd see him and I'd say, "Father Pavel, where are you going?" And he'd go, "Oh, I'm going to go sell my goats." Because he would sell his goats, because the Lord would say, "We'll separate the sheep from the goats." But I think that sort of comfortable relationship with confession is what we as priests want to cultivate, is just to say, I'm going to go sell my goats. It's the grace box. It's the place of the Lord's encounter with you. I always say to the penitent, this is your moment of victory today, because heaven's rejoicing in this.
You mentioned in terms of frequency of confession, Father, and we always like to just pass it on because a lot of people point out, or they're aware of, that technically speaking, we're only, quote unquote, required to go to confession once a year. But I got to tell you, that's not going to be near enough for me. So, I mean, what's the church's recommendation in terms of confession?
Sure. Yeah. We need to go to confession anytime we sin gravely. That's sort of the simplest way. Grave sin is grave because it's deadly, and it's deadly because we've separated ourselves from communion with God. And to exist in that place is not like this like punishment, like God is there sitting above us, but it should be sort of this reminder that this is not how we should be living our lives. It goes all the way back to the first sin in the Garden of Eden of basically supplanting God with ourselves, saying, I am the master of my sort of way, my path, and I'm going to sort of follow that. And so there is a certain, and as I meet with people, sometimes they want like this exhaustive list of grave sins, mortal sins. Now, there are things that are always objectively mortal, and so we can give those lists. But also there is a certain element of our own sort of capacity to freely choose something, knowing that it's grave, and knowing that to do so is separating ourselves from communion with God. So I kind of tell people, and they ask, well, how often should I go? I said, go as often as you need to. But at the same time, I kind of quote Cardinal O'Malley. He once said, go every time you get your hair cut. I think that's a good sort of anecdotal way. It's like every 6 to 8 weeks. Okay. At least we're checking in. Growing up for me, my school, I went to parochial school. We would go once a semester. My dad and my mom, we'd go as a family during Advent. We'd go as a family during Lent. And even getting older when I was in college, and even today, my dad will still text all 8 of us and just say, hey, it's Advent. Remember, take time for confession. And I'll text my dad back and be like, Dad, I'm a priest. I'm like, I'm living the Christian life, but I appreciate always the reminder. We kind of just need to be nudged a little bit sometimes.
Yeah, I really like that. I think that's really actually kind of sweet that your dad still texts. And
totally.
Yeah, I think that's really good, really good. Yeah, and I know that some people take on confession as kind of a devotional practice as well. I know, for instance, for me personally, certainly if I'm aware of a mortal sin on my conscience, I got to get rid of that right away. But even the venial sins, if it's too long between confessions, it seems like I start to, I don't know, just feel kind of spiritually icky. I mean, they start to kind of seem to pile up, and it's just a refreshment to kind of, it's a quick dip in the pool, so to speak, to go to confession. I don't want that to be misusing the sacrament at all. And I also know that I don't want to err into scrupulosity either. So is there some kind of way of determining, like, this is a great usage of the sacrament, a reception of the sacrament, versus, this is kind of probably misusing or abusing it?
Sure. St. Thomas Aquinas would talk about the spiritual benefit of confessing your venial sins as part of an integral confession. Okay. And I would say that I think that it's helpful because you can begin to determine a pattern of sin and say, okay, you know what? I don't struggle with that spiritual vice, but I do struggle with this. And I'm seeing all of the ways in which, this one moment of wrath actually isn't just one moment, but is preceded by all these other little angry moments. And it can draw someone, if they're in the practice of frequent confession and including their venial sins, into that. Now, at the same time, I remind people that, at Mass, our venial sins can be forgiven. There are other pious practices that can forgive those sins. But just personally, as a sinner, I am in the practice of doing it. I think what can become frustrating, and why you might have heard from some priests sometimes, oh, you don't need to confess that, or that's a venial sin, is just there's only, one of us or two of us, and there's limited time. And I think they just have concern for if somebody's coming every 3 days and they're just confessing a few venial sins, is this spiritually beneficial for them, or is there maybe some spiritual scrupulousness that's going on? So there's a balance always. And there the confessor can play a role of director to let them know what the right balance looks like.
Sure. Yeah, that's right. And I do know that there are, okay, this is just airing too much maybe of my own experience, but I have been in confession lines before where, a penitent will go in and I'm thinking, okay, it's getting kind of long in there. It's getting kind of long. I'm struggling with impatience as it is. And now I'm starting to, it's like, and maybe the Lord is using that opportunity to try to teach me something at that point too. But yeah, I think the general, would you say the general thing is, we don't need, or the priests don't need the stories, the confessors don't need stories behind sins. They don't need setup. Just confess the sins. Is that pretty much it, Father? And then you'll ask for clarification if needed?
Yeah, I think often I'll interrupt someone, and if that's happening, and remind them that I'm available for, if you'd like to set up a pastoral meeting, is kind of what I encourage them to do. Just a gentle sort of response. We feel like we want to give all this context to this priest, but ultimately, certainly out of charity for our fellow brothers and sisters who might want to go and unburden themselves as well. We just need to be sort of expedient. One of the ways that I think is a good way just to put yourself in the right frame of mind is just how we begin. So we begin, bless me, Father, for I've sinned. It's been so long since my last confession. And then how I like to begin, it's been helpful for me, maybe it will be for you, is just to say, and I accuse myself of the following sins. And I find that using that word is helpful. It puts it into context. What's the accusation? Because we want to take that power away from the devil, who's the great accuser. So we don't need to fear our sin in the sense that we should be ashamed of it. We should offer it to the Lord wholeheartedly. And so I'm going to take that power from him. I'm going to accuse myself of the following sins. I was wrathful on one occasion. I gossiped on a number of occasions. I was lazy on 2 occasions, and just to provide that, the priest will interject if he feels he needs some context. I think especially important to that too is to take the time at the beginning just to give a little bit of a register of who you are. There's a difference between a newlywed and someone married 30 years talking about fighting in their marriage, right? If someone's a priest, I always say I'm a priest. I've been ordained this many years and I'm a pastor. And just to give some context to it, I find those details are more than enough. And when we begin to tell the narrative, often what we end up doing is confessing other people's sins. I want to confess anger because my husband just wouldn't do the jobs that I needed him to do. And you're like, okay, why are we here? So I think finding a way just to sort of step into it in the right way, the right frame of mind is so important.
Maybe just give us a reminder of some of the good elements for a good examination of conscience.
Sure. I'll kind of walk penitents through. It's been a while since they've been to confession. And sometimes I'm almost surprised that the Lord leads them into confession and they're like, haven't done an examination. It happens more often than I think people realize. I'm very assiduous about it. So sometimes we just got to okay, they're coming in and they're just ready. And they're like, now what do I do? So the first thing that I keep in mind is your relationship with God, your relationship with your family, your relationship with your neighbor, and your relationship with yourself. And just those 4 pillars, I think, are a very fruitful way of breaking down your life, especially according to your own condition and vocations. When you hear family, if you're a teenager, that's how you're relating to your parents and your siblings. But if you're a family and you're a husband or wife, okay, that takes on a different context. So just using the 10 commandments as a way to walk through is really fruitful. Even just to begin with the first few about keeping the Sabbath, your relationship with the Lord, to not take his name in vain and what that means, walking them through that, not having any other gods before God, any other idols, and then kind of moving into your relationship with your family and other people. And the deadly sins, I think, are also a really helpful way to begin to sort of needle down into what you struggle with. Often if it's been a while, to not be overwhelmed by that, the priest is going to walk you through how to make a good and integral confession. If you're listening to this and you haven't gone to confession in a long time, take this as your sign, right? Go to confession. Just know that the Lord's love is going to come to you in that sacrament, and his spirit is one of peace, not anxiety. The devil comes to us with the spirit of anxiety. So just to know, the priest is going to walk you through that. So even if you don't do it, you don't feel prepped, don't worry, he'll walk you through it. I would say alternatively as well, for those who go with frequency, one of the best things that you can do is what Ignatius offers us in his spiritual tradition of the daily examen at midday and then before bed. And that examen is not necessarily a full examination of conscience, but you're just trying to have an awareness of your day at midday and at the end of it, how you've interacted with other people and how you've recognized God's presence throughout the day.
Mm-hmm. Let me also mention that on the Relevant Radio app, if you click on the little Pray tab down at the bottom there, you can go right to Confession Helper, and there's a great examination of conscience right there as well. So if you're looking for one, there's a great place to find one. Download the Relevant Radio app and check out that as well as all the other resources that are there. This entire episode of The Inner Life is on the Relevant Radio app. The Relevant Radio app is completely free and updated daily with fresh articles, podcasts, and prayers. Don't delay, download the app today. And thanks for listening.